if your network, if your group of patients is interested in working on protocol designs, that is clinical studies, if you know of products that are in development, and if you're willing to consider sitting down with the developers and having heart-to-heart discussions with them, then maybe community advisory boards is what your network could do. Your network, so the community advisory board is, in a nutshell, a group of patients who offer what we know as patients living with diseases to sponsors of clinical research. It can be on the full program development of a drug or a series of drugs or family of drugs that a company or a sponsor might have. Or it could be on one single clinical trial. Many times companies come to us sort of at the last minute, so to speak, and say, we need help with this clinical trial. We need to get it off the ground. We need to go to the regulators and talk about it, but we need patient input. So it might be, and that might be a faster thing to deal with. But I'll say now, and if I don't say it again, I should say it on every slide, that this is a long-term proposition with the sponsor. It's not a focus group that meets once and then you disperse, but it's something that you'll continue working with the company, the sponsor, over time with their research and development. And then there's things beyond research that also community advisory boards, especially in rare diseases, are more and more engaged with. Things like surveys, quality of life, real world evidence, registries. Many rare diseases don't have strong registries or strong international cohorts of natural history, for example. So maybe that's something also that the CAB could talk about. And even simple state-of-the-art management is not done in many cases. And so it might be something, again, to talk about with sponsors, but with other people, with universities, with clinicians, et cetera, to talk about just managing the disease as well. And this same group of patients, let's say 7 to 12 patients from all around Europe and sometimes beyond Europe, advises multiple sponsors at the same time, not in the same room necessarily, but over a period of time, they continue developing their knowledge and sharing that knowledge with more than one sponsor. And these patients are chosen by the patient network, and the agenda, as well as the secretariat, is driven by the patients as well as by the sponsor. So when we get together and have a meeting with the company, we make the agenda together. I should have put this maybe a couple slides earlier, but this is the agreement that we now have EUPATI Spain with Eurordis, just that in fact, EUPATI Spain, we're still following the guidelines and the parameters that we set up through Eurordis as a rare disease program. So I just wanted to throw that in there so you see that there's an actual document that we've both parties signed saying that we will follow the Eurordis guidelines going forward. And so in a more pretty picture sort of way, this is what a CAB does. I call it the scope, but this is really everything that a CAB, or most things that a CAB might do. Like I said, it could be a clinical trial protocol, but all aspects of a clinical trial protocol. I mentioned here informed consent, but it could be everything. It could be the inclusion-exclusion criteria. It could be the understanding of the objectives, or it could be a tweaking of the objectives that a sponsor comes and says, and the patients say, this really doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's lots of places within the clinical study where patient voice can be heard. Strategy trials, where many times at the end of the day, more than one drug and more than one company will be used by the same patient. So perhaps there's a place for strategy trials where we look at trials with multi-sponsors. Compassionate use program is always really important to talk about with sponsors. That is, once trials are enrolled and up and running, is there a place or a space for access to the product in development through what's called a compassionate use program outside of the clinical study. And like I said, all the things within the development pipeline can be included in a community advisory board. And of course, pricing, which is they tend to use value and access instead of pricing, but I think really what the issue is pricing, and that's something also that is very important to people living with rare diseases. So those are some of the places that we can have an impact with a sponsor on clinical trials. So you look for a group of patients. We will train them, basically going through what you're doing with summer school. We also can include some things from winter school, as well as things from the UPATI program itself, to form a group of people who can follow the research over a fairly long period. They meet regularly. The training calls are once a month, while the internal governance calls can also be once a month. And then there are the actual calls right now that are online versus face-to-face, where we would meet with sponsors. There's a mentor from UPATI who would help with the organization and governance of the CAB, and all the costs that are part of, that make up this this program are covered by the company. So there's no cost to the patients involved in putting this together. There's documents that, like I said, Francois and I have already put together that we would just ask the companies to look at, understand, as well as the CABs, and agree to, for example, the memorandum of understanding. This is how we will move forward. The agendas and members, whenever possible, are made public for transparency's sake, and that there's we can help with horizon scanning. UPATI Spain just is starting to use a new scanning tool that you can look by disease or by drug or by company for specific results from clinicaltrials.gov, as well as from UDRA-CT or CTIS. But it's much more patient friendly because we've made it ourselves. And hopefully with doing the CAB program, that we will help shorten the development time of a product. We'll work on things like patient-friendly, patient-reported outcome measures and patient-relevant outcome measures. So that's really important, that we can help with making the trial more useful for people who are living with the diseases. And all of that, hopefully, if the trial is more useful and more patient-friendly, that faster recruitment and better retention will be the result of that. And all of that sort of goes back to shortening the development time, as well as at the end of the day, making hopefully higher quality results. If the product is good and goes through the regulatory process, that hopefully approval will be faster, as well as market access. Again, market access is something that many companies sort of stop at, especially in rare diseases, at the big 5 or the big 8 countries within Europe. And so the CAB, again, is another mechanism by which we can make it clear that companies need to offer treatment and access to that treatment to everyone in Europe. Again, we can talk about registries, and the CAB is a good way for companies to get a better idea of people living with or parents of kids who have the disease. At one CAB, I think I've told this story before, but at one community advisory board, the medical director came and he said that he had been working in the company for 10 years and he'd never met a person living with the disease on which he had been working for 10 years. So I think it's also a good way for companies simply to have their eyes open and to understand a broader realization of what they're doing. So I just have 3 examples of successes in 3 different CABs that I thought might be interesting to go through very quickly. But for example, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they've been able to reduce the number of biopsies in different clinical trials. And that's really important, especially for the little boys who are in the trial, to maybe instead of having 3 biopsies, only have 2, for example. Of course, all of these things are approved by not only the company, but by their regulatory departments as well. And maybe even perhaps they go back to the EMA and they say, can we have 2 biopsies instead of 3? So it's not simply the quote unquote whim of patients, but it's really because it makes sense from a scientific point of view as well. They've reduced the number of tests and questionnaires in studies as well. They've shortened the time on placebo to in Duchenne, there wasn't an approved drug. So of course, people wanted to get on the active drug as soon as they could. So they reduced the placebo time to 1 year in one study to 6 months in another. And again, randomization ratio, which we talked about a little bit this morning in ethics, they were able to change from 1-to-1 to other more positive for the patients, more interesting for the patients as well to come into. So those are some of the positive things from Duchenne. From cystic fibrosis, Duchenne and cystic fibrosis are the 2, let's say, oldest CABs. They're about 4.5 years old now. Cystic Fibrosis Europe came up with a document that I'll show on the next slide, which they call the tracker, and which they agree upon with each company about what they want to see within the clinical trial. And in broad strokes, that's clinical research, access, communications, and then patient support, quality of life. Cystic fibrosis, like Duchenne previously, has worked on a ton of informed consent forms to make them more understandable, shorter, and more useful, again, for, at the end of the day, for the patients who enter the study. Cystic fibrosis also worked on a paper with us on monitoring and evaluation to try to actually measure the success rates of community advisory boards. And that's an ongoing process that we'll continue to be working on over the next few years. And in the case of cystic fibrosis, they try to have everyone in the CAB, all the members, also have specific areas of responsibility, which I'll show you on the next slide. So this is what I said before, the tracker. It's very simple, but very useful, where they have 4 big priority areas that you can see here on the left: access, research, quality of life, and communication. Then they put in the next column their goals. What do they want to achieve with each of those big priority areas within the trial or within the study that they're working with a specific company on? Then what will the collaboration look like with the company? So of course the company is also involved in agreeing to this tracker. Then what are the specific actions that will happen? The milestones are when they will happen. And then finally, at some point in the future, has the goal been reached? Has it not been reached? Has it partially been reached? So those are ways that they try to better understand their value within the process of clinical trials. And the final example I use is from a newer CAB, cystinosis, that started in 2019. And their very first CAB meeting, they met with a company who said, all the patients need to stop their current therapy 60 days before entering the trial. And immediately, just about everyone in the room stood up and said, that's impossible. There's only one drug that works, and our kids need it, and they're not going to stop the drug for 2 months before they start this therapy. I think the company was a little bit surprised. They went home, but they thought about it, and they talked with regulatory. They talked with the clinical department. They finally realized we don't need to stop existing products before the actual day 0 of the new trial, when we'll start the new therapy. So they sent a message to the community advisory board that yes, you can continue on your treatment until day 0 of the new trial. And I like that just because it was sort of a quick win. It was the first time they had met with a company and they already had this, I think, fairly major important result that turned into a more interesting trial for people who were living with the disease. And I think this is my second last slide, so there'll be a little bit of time for questions if there are any. But we've set up 9 CABs over the past 4.5 years, 6 active, 3 autonomous. The Duchenne CAB, for example, is autonomous now. But in that time, we've looked at 38 clinical studies, 43 products. For example, just to clarify, I haven't updated my Duchenne numbers for about 6 to 9 months. So I need to speak with the chair of Duchenne to update these numbers. So these numbers are probably a little bit bigger than what they are here. There are 111 CAB members to date who have done 68 hours of training online and 100 hours of face-to-face when we used to do face-to-face, and hopefully we'll go back to doing that in the future. We've met with 22 companies in 24 meetings over the last 4.5 years. And there we go. The final slide is if you're interested, what can happen next. So the best way to get members is through a patient network if it exists. So and then we can do all things like training and governance, etc. I put here still from when it was face-to-face, where there would be 3 to 4 day meetings twice a year. Now on virtual, the meetings are not so structured in a time slot, but they can happen over a longer period of time. It's a little, I thought it would be okay to sort of not structure when the meetings would be, but actually it's very difficult for patients to sort of be on call, let's say 365 days a year. So we're trying to maintain let's say a month when cystic fibrosis will meet with 3 companies in April and then in November, just so everyone can concentrate better. And like I just said, they meet usually with 2 or 3 companies per meeting. And there needs to be a chair or a secretary or a devoted person from the network side, as well as, of course, from the EUPATI Spain side for working on the agenda, etc. And if you want, we, EUPATI Spain, can present this same thing to your board of directors or to your general assembly so that everyone can better understand what is a CAB and what can a CAB maybe bring to your network. And like I said, we have guidelines and documents to share that hopefully make things a little smoother and a little faster working. And we suggest that if we know that we'd like a meeting in January of 2023, we should start talking now, just so there's time for preparatory planning, a little bit of training. Training takes 11 months, but we think that at least if we go halfway through the training, we then be in a better position to meet with companies. And my final slide is just my email. So